In the month of Elul that leads up to the High Holy Days, starting a week from Saturday night, we undertake cheshbon nefesh, reckoning of the soul. Like the English word reckoning, cheshbon literally refers to accounting. We are to look closely at our deeds like a balance sheet. We undertake tshuva, literally return, and figuratively repentance. When we say that repentance is a form of return, we affirm that each of us is fundamentally good. As we say in the morning liturgy, my God, the soul you have placed in me is pure. Elohai neshama, another word for soul in Hebrew, from the root to breathe, meaning all that breathes within us. Shenatata bi, Zehorahi, pure is it. We also have the power to make choices. When we stray from our inherent goodness, our task is to return to it. We seek out our pure soul, our neshama tahora, at our core. We look at where we have gone off course with unflinching cheshbon nefesh, reckoning of the soul, and we chart the way back. The framework of cheshbon nefesh and tshuva can guide us in understanding the Israel-Gaza conflict. Given the complexity and difficulty of this subject, I hope you will understand, and I'm grateful for your understanding, that this Devar Torah will be longer than usual. Amid our time's chaos, we might find clarity through these steps, identifying the pure soul, neshama tahora, at the heart of Israel's identity, engaging in cheshbon nefesh, reckoning with the choices that Israel's current government is making, and asking what might it look like for Israel to chart a course of return, tshuva, to its core values and ideals once again. Inevitably, we will not all have the same opinions about how to translate these values into policy, and so we must begin with a sense of honoring dispute for the sake of heaven, machloket l'shem shamayim, in the words of the Talmudic rabbis, and with bonds of care for each other. All countries and societies ought to undertake cheshbon nefesh and tshuva. America, amid our own national turmoil, Britain in the age of Brexit, Russia as it wages war on Ukraine, China amid its persecution of the Tibetans and the Uyghurs, the Palestinians, and especially Hamas, the perpetrators of October 7th. As Tom Friedman wrote during the Second Intifada, criticizing Israel is not anti-Semitic, and saying so is vile. But singling out Israel for opprobrium, out of all proportion to any other party in the Middle East, is anti-Semitic, and not saying so is dishonest. At the same time, it is important to us, for our Jewish homeland, to reflect Judaism's highest values. We can simultaneously call out those who criticize Israel with anti-Semitic double standards, demonization, or delegitimization, and engage in thoughtful critique of Israel's policies because we care about Israel. We can ask hard questions about Israel's leadership and care passionately about Israel's right to exist. As Rabbi Rachel Timoner of Brooklyn said recently, many countries on earth have committed heinous sins, but we do not conclude that therefore they should not exist. Not even Germany faced such a campaign after World War II. We can support Israel's inherent right to defend its people, like all nations, under Article 51 of the UN Charter, and identify where we may see Israel's government exceeding the scope of this right. Yitzhak Rabin wisely encapsulated this ethos of both and, not either or, when he said, "We will fight terror as if there is no peace, and make peace as if there is no terror." When it comes to our self-defense and our values, we can and must undertake both. Let's begin with identifying the neshama tahora, the pure soul at the heart of Israel, to which we can return through tshuva. The most classic expression of Israel's core values is in the Israeli Declaration of Independence. The state of Israel will be open for Jewish immigration, aliyah Yehudit, and for the ingathering of the exiles, kibbutz galuyot. It will be based on the foundations of freedom, justice, and peace, hacherut, hatzedek, v'hashalom, according to the vision of the prophets of Israel, chazonam shel nevi'ei Yisrael. Israel's Declaration of Independence upholds both the importance of a safe homeland for the Jewish people and the Jewish values of freedom, justice, and peace, using Hebrew words imbued with meaning, like cherut, freedom, as we sing in Kiddush on Pesach, calling the holiday Zman Cherutenu, the season of our freedom. Tzedek, justice, from the same root as tzedakah, charity, and shalom. With this vision of Israel's pure soul, let us together engage in cheshbon nefesh about how Israel's current administration is wielding power. We will not be able to cover every detail tonight, but this is not the first or last time we will explore these questions together. The current war in Gaza began when Hamas inflicted the deadliest day for the Jewish people since the Holocaust on October 7th, 2023. Hamas killed about 1,200 people and took 251 hostages, targeting civilians simply for living in the modern Jewish homeland. Since October 7th, the war has had several different phases. When we reflect on recent months, we can trace 5 developments that mark this current phase of the war as distinctly, deeply troubling. The first of these disturbing developments is the famine in Gaza. On March 2nd, during a temporary ceasefire, Israel blocked all aid into the Gaza Strip. On March 18th, Israel ended the temporary ceasefire, launching airstrikes. These decisions by Israel's government do not represent its people. About 70% of Israelis support a ceasefire and hostage release deal, including a majority of those who voted for Netanyahu's administration. The Israeli government accused Hamas of pillaging UN aid, though 2 senior Israeli military officials told the New York Times that Israel never found evidence that Hamas systematically did so. On May 18th, Prime Minister Netanyahu allowed only what he called minimal aid into Gaza. Israel and the US established the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, or GHF, an aid organization outside the UN. The GHF has only 4 aid sites. Israeli soldiers have shot at Palestinians as they have come for aid. On June 3rd, the New York Times reported thousands of desperate and hungry Palestinians have been coming early each day in hopes of securing food. The Israeli military said its forces had fired near a few people who had strayed from the designated route and did not respond to warning shots, and said they had posed a threat to soldiers. A military spokeswoman declined to explain the nature of the perceived threat. Earlier today, the UN Human Rights Office said that as of last Wednesday, at least 1,760 Palestinians have been killed while seeking aid. 994 in the vicinity of GHF sites, and 766 along the routes of supply convoys. Most of these killings were committed by the Israeli military, unquote. These measures causing the famine in Gaza are devastating. The UN World Food Program said recently that 1/3 of Gaza's population is going without food for multiple days in a row. Aid workers have seen children too frail to pick through trash for food or even cry. The World Health Organization said of 74 malnutrition-related deaths in Gaza in 2025, 63 occurred in July, including 24 children under 5. On August 6th, after US pressure, Israel agreed to devote 3 billion shekels, around $875 million, to aid in Gaza. Israel is also pausing fighting daily in some areas to allow aid convoys to move and letting aid be airdropped. Aid officials say Israel's new gestures are, as the New York Times sums it up, far too little, far too late. Nothing less than a ceasefire will allow the necessary avalanche of aid to flow safely into Gaza, unquote. Former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, from the moderate center-left, has described Israel's policy as starving out Gaza and has identified it as a war crime. Olmert is echoing the statute of the International Criminal Court in The Hague, which includes in its list of war crimes. intentionally using starvation of civilians as a method of warfare by depriving them of objects indispensable to their survival, including willfully impeding relief supplies. Second, Israel has been destroying parts of Gaza on an enormous scale and designating areas as forbidden for Palestinians to enter. Yaakov Garb, a professor at Ben Gurion University, analyzed the IDF's maps and concluded that as of April 7th, Palestinians are prohibited from entering about half the Gaza Strip. He told NPR, "We've shifted to a regime in which you have very extensive areas that are functioning more as large moats around shrinking enclaves of the remaining Gazan population," unquote. Israel now controls 3/4 of the Gaza Strip. Nearly all Gaza's 2 million residents are in the remaining quarter. As of July 15th, nearly 70% of civilian infrastructure across the Gaza Strip has been damaged or destroyed, according to the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect. One key reason for this destruction is Hamas's long-standing illegal and immoral war strategy of storing and firing rockets aimed at Israeli civilians from and near civilian buildings in Gaza, like schools, playgrounds, mosques, hospitals, and UN facilities, using the people in these buildings as human shields, a double war crime targeting Israeli civilians, using their own civilians as human shields, for which Hamas must be held accountable. The NATO Strategic Communications Center of Excellence explains how this strategy puts Israel in an excruciating position. Quote, "Hamas employs a win-win scenario. If the IDF uses force and the number of civilian casualties surges, Hamas can use that for a PR victory. But if the IDF limits its use of military power to avoid collateral damage, Hamas will be less vulnerable to Israeli attacks," unquote. Hamas's system of tunnels, stretching hundreds of miles under nearly all of the Gaza Strip, also presents a threat to Israeli safety and is near impossible to destroy without collateral damage to civilian lives and buildings. However, not all the IDF's destruction can be attributed to Hamas's strategy. For one large-scale example, Israel has created a military buffer zone within Gaza, roughly 0.6 miles in depth, spanning the entire border between Gaza and Israel, by destroying homes, factories, and farmland. This area is about 1/6 of Gaza and used to hold about 35% of Gaza's agricultural land. The law of war does not permit destroying civilian property unless it is a military necessity, meaning, quote, "There needs to be a legitimate military objective, and the only way to achieve it would be to destroy the civilian property," as Janina Dill, co-director of Oxford's Institute for Ethics, Law, and Armed Conflict, said to CNN. "At that scale, that's simply not quite plausible," she said. Note the words "at that scale." Israel, like any country, has the right to carry out some actions like these in defense of its security. The argument is that the sheer scale of destruction goes beyond what military objectives would plausibly require. By contrast, Israel's security barrier with the West Bank, which has been extremely successful at keeping out terrorists, with sections of fence and wall as well as ditches, has a width of about 54 yards, 77 yards, in some places 110 yards, making it 10 to 20 times thinner than Israel's new buffer zone with Gaza. In April, the Israeli organization Breaking the Silence published a report with soldiers' testimony from the Gaza buffer zone. The report's summary is hard to read or hear, yet is worth quoting at length. Soldiers were given orders to annihilate whatever was within the designated perimeter, including entire residential neighborhoods, educational institutions, mosques, industrial zones, and agricultural areas, regardless of whether those areas had any connection whatsoever to the fighting. Many buildings were destroyed after being incriminated, meaning in use by the enemy's warfare. However, many of the buildings were demolished without being incriminated. Some soldiers even testified that certain commanders viewed the destruction as a way of exacting revenge for October 7th. The basic order was to permit Palestinians from entering the perimeter. The basic order was to prevent Palestinians from entering the perimeter by shooting at them. But there was no clear marking indicating its boundaries, putting the life of any Palestinian who crossed this imaginary line at risk, unquote. Given how difficult this subject is, let's all take 3 deep breaths together to pause and absorb in bonds of love before we continue. Third, multiple Israeli officials have stated that a goal of the war is to ensure all Palestinians leave Gaza and to replace them with Jewish settlers. This movement has been steadily growing. For example, in January 2024, Cabinet Minister Shlomo Kar'i called for, quote-unquote, voluntary emigration of Palestinians from Gaza and clarified, quote, voluntary is at times a situation you impose on people until they give their consent. President Trump endorsed and magnified this idea last February by saying, we should go to other countries and build various domains that will ultimately be occupied by the Palestinians living in Gaza. The US will take over the Gaza Strip. The world's people will live there. It'll be the Riviera of the Middle East. Netanyahu has now said it is a condition of ending the war that we carry out the Trump plan. This movement's most influential figures are the heads of Israel's 2 far-right parties, Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich and National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir. Speaking about Gush Katif, Israel's main block of settlements in Gaza, before Israel pulled out of Gaza in 2005, Smotrich said he does not want to go back to Gush Katif because it's too small. It needs to be much bigger, much more expansive. Smotrich has also called his fellow Knesset members, who are Israeli Arabs or Palestinian citizens of Israel, enemies who are here by mistake. Ben-Gvir is a disciple of the extremist Rabbi Meir Kahane, who wrote a book about the Palestinians called They Must Go, and whose political party was banned from the Knesset under Israeli law for incitement to racism in 1988. Ben-Gvir posted on X on July 26th, the only way to win the war and bring back the hostages is to completely stop the quote-unquote humanitarian aid, conquer the entire Gaza Strip, and encourage voluntary migration. On the ground, Israel has indeed severely restricted humanitarian aid for months. Netanyahu recently said his goal is to conquer the entire Gaza Strip. Israel already controls 3/4 of it, and the Security Cabinet has approved Netanyahu's proposal to take over Gaza City, which lies within the remaining quarter of the Gaza Strip, where almost all of Gaza's 2 million residents live. It is important to be precise about what these policies are and what they are not. As New York Times columnist Bret Stephens wrote, Israel's policies do not amount to a Wannsee Conference, the meeting at which the Nazis began to carry out the final solution, a plan to intentionally wipe off the face of the earth a people, Jews, with no way to escape. This distinction matters immeasurably. At the same time, if Israel controls all of Gaza and creates conditions in which people cannot plausibly survive, then Gazans' only feasible option is to leave. To this end, Defense Minister Yisrael Katz recently proposed, with Netanyahu's backing, what he called a quote-unquote humanitarian city in southern Gaza near Egypt's border, in practice forcing 600,000 Palestinians there initially, and eventually Gaza's whole population. Katz said the Palestinians there will not be allowed to leave, except to emigrate to other countries. Former Prime Minister Ehud Olmert said, if Palestinians will be deported into the new humanitarian city, then you can say that this is part of an ethnic cleansing. Moshe Ya'alon went further. Ya'alon, Netanyahu's own former defense minister from the Likud party and a former IDF chief of staff, described Israel's policy as, quote, conquering, annexing, ethnic cleansing. Look at northern Gaza. There's no more city of Beit Lahia. There's no more city of Beit Hanun. They're cleaning the area of Arabs. I'm talking about soldiers moving populations thinking it's for operational purposes, like evacuating civilians from combat zones. But the intention of far-right leaders like Smotrich and Ben Gvir is an open and declared one, unquote. Israel has expressed that it is aiming to pressure Hamas to lay down its arms and release the hostages. This strategy is not working, as evidenced by the fact that at this late date in the war, Hamas has not done so. In any case, causing famine and large-scale destruction and attempting to replace an area's population with one's own settlers is impermissible under the law of war and inconsistent with the Jewish values of the Israeli Declaration of Independence. Fourth, Israel's decision to continue the war has led to continuing death on both sides. Even a war that began justly can only stay just if there is still a goal that is legitimate, is achievable, and cannot be achieved by any means other than war. Increasingly, Israelis doubt that this war is still just. As the New York Times reported, at key stages in the war, Netanyahu's decisions extended the fighting in Gaza longer than even Israel's senior military leadership deemed necessary, unquote. By July's end, Palestinian deaths exceeded 60,000, according to the Gaza Health Ministry. Because the health ministry is run by Hamas, its numbers cannot be independently verified and do not distinguish between combatants and civilians. How do we make sense of these imperfect numbers? Two Australian academics examined Hamas's claim in March that women and children, a proxy for civilians, made up about 70% of deaths, roughly comparable to America's record in the war in Iraq. These academics analyzed the data from Hamas's own health ministry and found that, in fact, women and children accounted for just under 51% of deaths, some of whom were male teenage combatants, a much better record than America's in Iraq. This record testifies to the IDF's many efforts to avoid killing civilians amid urban warfare and Hamas's utterly cynical strategy of using their own civilians as human shields. At the same time, once there is no more justification for continuing the war, further civilian deaths can and must be avoided through a plan to reach a ceasefire. A turning point came in the middle of last year. In May, Benny Gantz, a former IDF chief of staff turned centrist politician and member of the Emergency War Cabinet, called on Netanyahu to make a plan for the day after the war, for a civilian government in Gaza that would include Palestinians outside of Hamas and Arab, European, and American partners. In other words, to acknowledge that an indefinite Israeli presence in Gaza is not tenable, or else Gantz would pull his party from the government. Gantz said, within the holy of holies of Israeli security, personal and political considerations have begun to penetrate. Gantz meant that Netanyahu is perpetuating the war because if he agrees to leave Gaza, his far-right coalition partners will leave the government, leading to new elections that Netanyahu is forecasted to lose. And given his criminal trials, he might go to jail. Netanyahu rejected Gantz's plea. In June, Gantz's party left the government. Then in July, during negotiations toward a ceasefire and hostage release deal, Netanyahu made a demand that was against IDF officials' advice and that Hamas had already rejected, thus blocking negotiations. At one point in August, at a meeting discussing this issue, Defense Minister Yoav Gallant responded, "The Prime Minister can indeed make all the decisions, and he can also decide to have all the hostages killed." Netanyahu later fired Gallant. What Gantz and Gallant really meant last year was the war has reached a point of diminishing returns and devastating risk for the remaining hostages. What can be accomplished militarily largely has been accomplished. Now we must move forward. Otherwise, both sides will be trapped in endless violence, and the hostages will die in captivity. This brings us to the fifth and final piece of our cheshbon nefesh tonight. The remaining Israeli hostages are not yet free. 50 Israeli hostages remain in captivity in Gaza, of whom Israel believes only about 20 are still alive. The families of 20 Israelis cannot embrace their loved ones. The families of 30 more Israelis are deprived of even the modicum of closure of being able to bury their loved ones. Consider the heartbreaking words that former hostage Elisha Rabi said on Israeli TV last June. "We didn't have a doubt even when we were in a tunnel 50 meters underground, and the four of us hostages discussed this point exactly, that if there were a different political makeup of the Israeli government, we would have been freed a long time ago. It was clear to us then, and it has been more clear to us since our release." Where do we go from here? How do we go forward? Or, in the process of national cheshbon nefesh, how do we return back to the neshama tahora, the pure soul of Israel? First, we join in supporting the statements from the Union for Reform Judaism, to which our congregation belongs, and the Central Conference of American Rabbis, to which I belong, calling for Israel to usher in more food, water, and aid, and work toward a ceasefire and hostage release agreement, and not to take over more of Gaza, push Palestinians out of Gaza, or replace them with Jewish settlers. The statements say, Hamas bears the responsibility for this war, for failing to put down its arms, and for its refusal to release the hostages. However, Israel has the ability and responsibility to prioritize its own people and values. Let us not allow our grief to harden into indifference, nor our love for Israel to block us from attending to the cries of the vulnerable, unquote. We support the donation by the United Jewish Appeal Jewish Federation of New York of $1 million for aid to civilians in Gaza. These steps shine a light for us on how to begin the journey of return, tshuva, to the Israeli Declaration of Independence's values: freedom, justice, and peace, hacherut, hatzedek, v'hashalom, according to the vision of the prophets of Israel, chazonam shel nevi'ei Yisrael. How do Israel's choices impact our Jewish identities? Many of us grew up with a sense of pride in Israel's actions. But there is another, indeed a deeper way to connect with Israel. We find a hint of it in the Declaration of Independence. When it cites the prophets of Israel, the text reminds us that the heroes of ancient Israel were not the kings, but the prophets. When kings like Ahab or even David did wrong, the prophets of Israel challenged them to fulfill the values of the Torah, the values to which the divine voice calls us. We feel connected to ancient Israel not because its kings were always right, but because it was our people's home, our ancestors' home. And within it, the prophets led our ancestors in fighting for the values that our home must live out. So too, what bonds us to modern Israel is not that its government is always right. No government in the world would pass that test. What bonds us to Israel is that it is the homeland of our people, the only Jewish majority society, the home of our kin in the Jewish family, and the struggle for the values that we believe Judaism teaches is a struggle we undertake in the homeland we love, as other peoples do in theirs, and as we all do in the struggle for a better world. We are just beginning our conversation together as a community about building and deepening this kind of connection to Israel. The first step is to articulate where the government's choices fall short of these values and to affirm that this is not in our name, not in the name of Judaism, not in the name of Israel's highest ideals, and must end. Out of love in our hearts for the best of what Israel is and can be. Again, we can critique Israel's government at the same time as we call out those who wrongfully accuse Israel with anti-Semitic bias, following Yitzhak Rabin's vision that our self-defense and our values are not an either-or, but a both-and proposition. When we do, we join the many Israelis who are doing the same. Former Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, former defense ministers and IDF chiefs of staff like Moshe Ya'alon, Yoav Gallant, and Benny Gantz. They are just as Israeli as Netanyahu, Smotrich, and Ben Gvir, and their critique resonates deeply with the principles of the Israeli Declaration of Independence. Israelis who regularly protest in the streets in numbers of 10,000 and even 100,000, extraordinary numbers per capita for a nation, for a ceasefire and hostage release deal, with signs calling to fulfill the mitzvah of Pidyon Shvuyim, redemption of captives. They represent Israel as part of a large majority that supports their cause, including even a majority of Netanyahu coalition voters. Netanyahu and his allies formed their government in the first place with only 48.4% of the vote, due to a quirk in Israel's electoral system not unlike America's electoral college. A majority of Israelis actually voted against the Netanyahu bloc. This month, The New Yorker published a piece entitled, "Israelis are starting to talk about famine in Gaza," quoting journalists like Oren Persico, who said, "You build a dam around your consciousness, but holes and cracks start to appear and the water eventually seeps through." These Israelis need us. They need our solidarity in this struggle across the Jewish people. We must stand with them, and we can take solace from knowing that we are all in this together. When we begin the month of introspection of Elul, we will start singing the Penitential Psalm, Psalm 27, which says, "Though a camp is marshaled against me, my heart shall not fear. Though battle is roused against me, nonetheless do I trust. One thing do I ask of the Eternal One, Adonai. It is this that I seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Eternal One all the days of my life, to sense the sweetness of the Eternal One and to come within God's temple." The military imagery is a metaphor for the battle within, because cheshbon nefesh and tshuva are profoundly hard, indeed vulnerable, and we need heroic bravery to carry them out. In this case, we are talking about tshuva precisely not to continue down the path of war. We need just as much bravery for, as Yitzhak Rabin also said, the war for peace, hamilchama al hashalom. Psalm 27 prompts us that when our hearts fear, we can acknowledge our fear and remind ourselves that we deserve not to fear, so that we may find the courage to work for cheshbon nefesh and tshuva for Israel as in our personal lives. And when we do, we will find, not tomorrow, but in time, that again, in our homeland's values, we can sense the sweetness of the Eternal One. Shabbat Shalom. Brachim to you. Thank you all so much. Achat Sha'alti met Adonai otava kesh. Achat Sha'alti met Adonai otava kesh. Shivti beveit Adonai kol yemei chayai lachazot benoam Adonai ulevaker beheichalo lachazot benoam Adonai ulevaker